What's up, everybody? Welcome into the Next Bats podcast. I'm Phil Perry. Great episode lined up for you today because we are fresh off the Patriots practice field after day 2 of mandatory minicamp. Plenty of takeaways there. Some trends starting to develop after 2 days of mandatory practices on the fields behind Gillette Stadium. They'll have one more. We'll give you a little recap of that one on the next Patriots Talk podcast, as we gave you a recap of day 1 on the last Patriots Talk podcast. So check that one out. Listen to that if you haven't already. But we will talk about day 2 here, some trends that we're seeing. Of course, we're going to check in with some of the young players. Which young players, first, second year guys, have the most on their plates? I think there's a name or two in there that may surprise you. And we're also going to talk to Jeff Grimes, Baylor offensive coordinator, who's going to tell us all about Tyquan Thornton, their time together, some of the things that he likes about Tyquan Thornton's game, aside from his speed, what he thinks about his frame and now how that will hold up at the next level, what he heard from NFL clubs before the draft and where he thought Thornton may be selected. It's a great conversation with Jeff Grimes. They did a lot of different things with that Baylor offense. He likes to think of his offense as a pro-style offense. So I'm sure the Patriots are hoping that helps Thornton transition from the college game to the pro ranks. But instead of continuing to ramble on here about Jeff Grimes, let's just hear from the man himself. Here's our interview with Baylor offensive coordinator Jeff Grimes. All right, very happy to have with us now Baylor offensive coordinator Jeff Grimes. Jeff, obviously you had a chance to get to know and work with Tyquan Thornton, who a lot of Patriots fans have a lot of interest in right now, as you can imagine. So I just want to ask you right off the bat, what kind of person are the Patriots getting in Tyquan Thornton, having spent the time with him that you did?
Man, Ty is one of my favorite kids. You know, I've been here at Baylor a year, and one of the things I really grew to appreciate about Ty is just his honesty, his candor. You know, I went through 2 situations with him where he could have been less than forthright or less than open with me. When I first took the job here a year and a half ago, January, he's from Miami. He's got 2 boys that live back there with their mom most of the year. And so I'm coming in. Our head coach, Dave Aranda, had been here for a year. I'm new, somewhat still of a transition time with the new staff. You know, Matt Rule had left the year before that, and I'm coming in. And so now not only is he having a transition time with the new head coach, but another new offense after having done that a year prior. And I'm basically trying to recruit him to stay, you know, instead of, you know, go somewhere else. In particular, he had opportunities to go places closer to home, closer to his family, closer to his boys. And I didn't even know him at the time, but I began to form a relationship with him, just talking with him on the phone. And throughout that time, he was just completely honest and forthright with me about where he was with everything and how he was going through making this decision. And then, you know, he decided to stay, and that was a big deal for me, just coming into this position, knowing that he was a guy that I really felt like could be a difference maker on our team. And then this last off season, you know, when he was trying to make a decision whether to come back to Baylor or turn pro, and I, along with a number of other people, you know, sought advice from people that I knew in the NFL, guys who had insight and an opinion about him and where he might be drafted. And throughout the whole process, again, sometimes in that situation, guys just they ghost you, you know, they disappear. They're talking to their agent, they're talking to their family, and they don't know you anymore as a college coach. But he was great. He maintained contact with me, and, you know, of course I wanted him to come back, but I told him in the beginning, I said, Ty, I honestly want what's best for you. And so if that's to go pro, then I'm for you. And I think in the end, although it could have gone either way for some time, I think he made the right choice. I'm happy for him.
So I'm curious, Jeff, and number one, when you use the word candor and you're talking about the Patriots, this is a place that lives off of candor, it feels like, and it's usually from the coaching staff to the players, but I'm sure it's appreciated. in both directions. But it is interesting to me that you, and I'm sure others, did some digging in terms of where you thought Thornton might end up being taken in the draft and what his pro prospects were this offseason. So I'm curious, were you surprised when the Patriots ended up taking him in the second round? Not just because of, I guess I'd love to get your reaction about the team fit and the marriage there, but also that he was a second round player.
Yeah, I would start by saying if you had asked me that before the combine, I might have said, yeah, that would surprise me. I heard honestly everything from this guy could be a high draft pick to this guy could be a really low round, possibly even a free agent pick. There were concerns about his size, about his frame, and so as I've been coaching college ball for a bunch of years and have talked through this process with a number of college players, and I got as large a variance in opinion on him as I have any player. But then I think the big turning point for him was the combine. He goes up there and he smashes his 40 and he shows people that he really can run. And I think that changed things for him. And then what typically happens is everybody goes back and they look at the tape again. And, I think his stock rose rapidly after that. And so I think post combine, I wasn't really surprised. Prior to that, I probably would have been if you had said that, just because there was such a wide variance. And this was on the, very upper end of that.
Right. And it does make sense when you run in the 4.2s at Indy that you start to turn some heads, maybe in a way that you hadn't previously. But I'd love to get from your perspective, somebody who watched him so closely, obviously in game, but on the practice field, off season, things of that nature, just how fast is Tyquan Thornton? Is there a story that pops to mind for you that best illustrates that trait that he obviously has?
I don't know if there's any one story. I just know every time I called a play that sent him deep, I asked myself, why am I not doing this more? Why am I not running this guy deep and throwing the ball up to him every other play? Because he has the unique ability to separate, and with his height and his long speed, he's an impressive guy once he gets going.
Yeah, I can imagine you'd feel pretty comfortable, regardless who is aligned across from him at corner, that you feel pretty good about Tyquan's ability to get by that guy if given enough time. I would love to ask you too. I mean, you mentioned his frame and some of the concerns there that people in the league had about his frame. I mean, what would you say to those people? Did it ever show up for you all at Baylor? And how do you think his frame will play at the next level? We did get a chance to talk to him the other day, and I asked him. He said, I'm eating a lot. I'm trying in terms of getting to where the team wants me to be. He's obviously not there yet. I think he was 181 pounds at the combine. But what would you say to people who look at his frame and say, I don't know if that could work at the NFL level?
I would say, number one, I think Ty is the kind of kid that is driven and wants to be good, and he wants to please you. He's not a kid that wants to fight his coaches or fight people who have his best interests in mind. And so I would say if people are encouraging him or setting a goal for him and then helping him put a plan in place, I would say first that I think he'll match that with his effort. And then the second thing I would say is just that, Ty, like a lot of college players, is still a work in progress. The year before I got here, I don't know, I think he had like 15 or 20 catches. He wasn't a guy that was a huge weapon. He wasn't a guy that had a ton of production. And then this year, he jumped out and he had that breakout year, so to speak. But I think this year was a work in progress still for him. And so the ability to get off press, the ability to be physical and block in the run game. We do run a pro style system, I would say, one that requires receivers to do a lot of things that a number of NFL teams do. And so there were challenges for him within that, but he really worked to meet every challenge, and I'm sure he will this one the same.
Did you guys ever push him in terms of off the field? Was it constant, or was it, man, you're a fast player, we don't want to do anything to make you less fast, So whatever your body type is, it is, and we'll work around that. How did you guys handle that as a coaching staff?
No, we tried to get him to put some weight on, and I think he put a little bit on during the year that I was here. But for some of those guys, it's just man, it's hard. It takes a lot of work and a lot of energy, and sometimes when they're in a college environment, it's harder than it is once they turn pro.
The last thing I'll ask you here, Jeff, because we're just telling you right before we started recording here, the Patriots just finished up their second mini camp practice, and Tyquan had probably his best catch as a Patriot. It's been a very small sample size. We know that, but he's down the field and he's well covered, and Brian Hoyer's actually playing quarterback, but he makes sort of this sliding / diving catch between a corner and a safety. And it just showed to me, it wasn't an instance necessarily where he was burning by someone 60 yards down the field and running in for a touchdown, but it showed really good concentration. And so I wanted to ask you, maybe what's his next best trait? Everybody's going to think of him as a speed guy first and foremost, I think, at least early in his career. But what's another trait of his that we should keep an eye on that could help him as a Patriot?
I think what you're saying is where I would go next is, I would say two things. So if you had just asked me that question cold, I probably would have said for a guy as long as he is, he does have good quickness. A lot of those guys have a little bit slower feet. It takes him a little bit longer to get going, and he can get off a press even though he's thin because he has good quickness and he can get his feet going in a short amount of time. The thing that you alluded to would be something that I would point out as well. He's comfortable catching the ball in traffic. A lot of guys that aren't the biggest, especially a guy that's built like him, you're a long, tall target that if you didn't have courage and you didn't understand how to work your body within tight windows, might be a little bit nervous when you're having to catch a ball in there. And, we didn't just throw him the ball deep. We threw him a bunch of balls underneath. And I think about a lot of the slants. He played X for us for the most part. We did move him around a little bit, but that puts him on the single side for us, often into the boundary and on the line of scrimmage. And so we threw him a bunch of slants, and those windows sometimes either between a corner and a will linebacker or between a safety and a linebacker, those are tight windows. And sometimes it's a bang, bang play where it's ball and contact. And there were very, very few instances where we threw him a ball in traffic in one of those tight windows that he didn't come up with it. And even when he didn't, he never shied away from making the play.
Well, he is a rare specimen. There's no doubt. It's going to be a lot of fun to watch him grow and develop in a variety of different ways here as a member of the New England Patriots. And so, Jeff Grimes, we thank you so much for teaching us a little bit more about this new Patriots receiver that everybody's so interested, Tyquan Thornton. Thanks so much.
Yeah, you got it. My pleasure.
All right, great stuff there from Jeff. Really appreciate him coming on. I know he's really busy this time of year. There's camps, there's recruiting, never stops for those college coaches. So really appreciate him joining us here on Next Pats, and interesting to hear about Tyquan Thornton's time there and about some of the quickness that he'll bring to the table. Some of that I think is pretty apparent when you watch him on tape, but I'm sure if you're following this podcast and you're watching or you're listening, odds are you've had a chance to go and somewhere on the internet find clips of Tyquan Thornton's tape. We've had a bunch on our stories on Tyquan Thornton, podcasts where we've talked about Tyquan Thornton. We're able to feed you guys a ton of these clips if you're watching with us on YouTube. And you can see some of that at the line of scrimmage, little shake and bake, those crossover moves, some of the stuff that guys like, say, Davante Adams get a lot of credit for. And of course, Thornton is nowhere near Davante Adams' level just yet. But Davante Adams isn't somebody who is blessed with blazing speed necessarily. He has a lot of great traits that make him a great receiver, the great receiver that he is. But one of them is just having a little bit more quickness than most his size, and the savvy to be able to use that at the line of scrimmage to be able to free himself up to run the routes that he needs to run and give him some initial separation before he can actually get into his route and create maybe even more separation for, Aaron Rodgers at one point in time, now Derek Carr, to find him and utilize him the way that he's been utilized. So will be really interesting to follow Thornton's development. I will say just one takeaway from me from training camp, mini camp thus far, with Tyquan Thornton is that the frame hasn't really come into play just yet because they're obviously not in pads. But we've seen him used on the outside. I've seen him used at times inside. We've seen him on underneath routes. We've seen him go down the field. We've seen him on special teams. His two best plays, I'll give you two before we get into the next segment of the pod. Two best plays through minicamp, two practices thus far. The first was a special teams play. Sprinting down the field, catching on the fly a Jake Bailey punt near the goal line. He's been used both days and even back to OTAs as a gunner. So they're trying to get that speed into the kicking game in some way, shape, or form. Now, again, do you want him out there at 180-ish pounds as a gunner in a situation where you're going to need to make a tackle in a critical spot? Maybe not. But in some other scenarios where you know the likelihood of a return isn't all that high, and you're just looking to get somebody down there really fast to down something near the goal line, inside the 5, inside the 10, maybe he can be a suitable option in that phase. You know, we know he's used to tracking the deep ball coming out of a quarterback's hand down the field. Can he do something similar, trying to track these punts, find them quickly in the air, turning his head while still maintaining his speed, using some of those same characteristics that he does as a deep threat receiver in the kicking game on the punt team? So that's big play number one from Tyquan Thornton. Big play number two was today. Pass down the right sideline from Brian Hoyer, where he beat Miles Bryant in coverage and was able to slide, sort of almost like a baseball slide, between Bryant and Devin McCourty, the free safety, over the top to reel in a pass that I would say went for about 30 or so yards, 30, 35 yards. So his best catch, I mentioned it in the discussion with Jeff there, his best catch as a Patriot, but I thought showed, number one, good speed, good ability to shake free of your defender initially in the route, and then good concentration to be able to finish off the play. So two nice moments for Tyquan Thornton through two practices. He's still healthy. He's still out there. All of these things are positive signs. And I think you can add those to everything we heard just now from Jeff and come away with a relatively optimistic picture, at this point at least, of the Patriots' second round pick at wide receiver. Fitting that we start at that wide receiver position as we get into our day two of minicamp recap here, because boy, that receiver room is looking pretty deep at the moment. When you're talking about Thornton making, one big play down the field, but he really wasn't even one of the standouts. Kendrick Bourne was back at practice today. He's going to have a role. Devontae Parker is going to have a role. Had a nice back shoulder sort of jump ball 50-50 type play over Jalen Mills on day one of minicamp. Jacoby Myers is going to have a role. And I will say, parenthetically, as long as he's on the roster, and the only reason I say that is because, and I don't think this would be the right move, but we know the Patriots aren't above dealing anyone going into the last year of their contract, which Myers is in. Very inexpensive. It's $4 million, starting caliber receiver, does a lot in the blocking game. Again, would be cuckoo, in my opinion, to use a scientific term, if the Patriots were to move on from him. But if he's on the roster, he will have a role, and a significant one. Then you're talking about Nelson Aguilar. He's making a lot of money. And I, as well as others, have wondered, can you end up releasing that guy and swallowing all that money, that dead money that'll count against your cap because you gave him such a big deal? Can you trade him? Can you get anything in a trade for somebody like that, given what he gave you last year, which was very, very little? But he's showed up in minicamp, especially on day two, where he caught one pass, little slant over the middle, where the speed was very apparent. And listen, these guys are not tracking each other down 80 yards down the field and sprinting and making tackles, but they are trying to finish, quote unquote, finish these plays in shorts and t-shirts. And he ran away from the defense. The best play of the day, both for him and for Mac Jones, in my opinion, was a high arcing pass down the left sideline to Aguilar, who is headed to the left sideline on what I believe was a deep over route. It could have been a corner. We're not able to watch all these guys go through the entirety of their routes from the snap, but it was either one of those. And so you can kind of picture how the route would finish, where he's flattening as he gets near the sideline and he's tracking the ball over his shoulder about 30, 40-ish yards down the field. And man, I think it was Mac Jones' best throw of the day, and we'll get into his day in more detail. But he dropped that thing in the bucket to Nelson Agholor, gets a knee down with tight coverage right there, right in front of Bill Belichick, who's standing there with the defensive coordinator from Utah State, who we basically chatted up the entirety of the practice. And he gets up and there's a huge celebration. Agholor, Jones sprints down the field to celebrate with him. But that just takes us to our overarching topic here, which is the receiver room is, again, it's 2 practices. Again, it's minicamp, grains of salt everywhere, right? But it's looking relatively deep. Now, Jakobi Meyers, who I mentioned, he actually was essentially a non-participant in this practice. He went up to the upper field for rehabbing players early in the session, did not do much. But again, you know what he is. Then there's Trey Nixon. We got to talk about Trey Nixon. This is the Next Pats podcast. Guy's a rookie last year. He does very little, but we talk about him at the time. That's Ernie Adams' draft pick. He's got some speed coming out of UCF. He's not the biggest guy in the world. He's about 6 feet, a little bit under 200 pounds, but has athleticism, has some toughness to him, and somebody that we've seen get a lot of opportunity. Day 1, Kendrick Bourne is out. Day 2, Jakobi Meyers is out. Who steps in but Trey Nixon? And Trey Nixon had 2 of the best catches of the day. One, again, very much like the Agholor throw, right in front of us as reporters who are standing there along the left sideline. Same direction, looked like a very similar route. It's either a corner or a deep over. I think this one was a corner route from Trey Nixon. And Jonathan Jones is right there on his back, but he catches it right at the sideline. Beautiful, explosive pickup on that particular throw. And then later in the practice, on more of a go ball where he is sprinting straight down the field. And Jonathan Jones, again, there in very tight coverage, he catches one with his right arm and he just pins it to his chest one-handed. Unbelievable throw from Mac Jones for him to even have the opportunity to do that, where he is mid-stride down the field with a very fast player on his back, and he's able to just have it right in his breadbasket there. Mac Jones couldn't have handed it to him any better. But a great, great catch from Trey Nixon to be able to finish. And Jonathan Jones sort of looks to the sky almost as if to say, I mean, really? But that's the kind of thing we have to follow. We have to track in minicamp. This is the Trey Nixon show through 2 days. He had one of the best completions on day 1. He comes through with 2 more on day 2. And this is what happens for players. Sometimes the good ones, when they have an opportunity, they make the most of it. And there's been opportunity there for Trey Nixon. Again, Bourne misses day 1. Myers misses day 2. You insert him in. It's not Christian Wilkerson. It's definitely not N'Keal Harry. It's not Malcolm Perry. You know, we have seen Tyquan Thornton out there at times with guys that we could call offensive regulars. You know, we're not really supposed to talk about who's starting, who's not, but you guys know the names. But Trey Nixon really has been the consistent present through 2 days. You know, we've seen Ty Montgomery even mix in a little bit with that early group with Mac Jones. But it's been Trey Nixon. And why take him out? Why give him fewer opportunities when all he's doing is showing that he can capitalize? And so on a couple of these, I mean, and he's getting the entire offense fired up. Mac Jones is sprinting down the field, trying to celebrate with his guy. That was what happened on the one-handed catch. On the first pass, which was towards the sideline on the corner route, Mac Jones sees that the ball is complete. Bon Jovi's blaring on the, I believe it was Bon Jovi, blaring on the PA system. And he throws his hands up in the air and he gives his own little version of the discount double check, I guess. But he gave 2, I would say, emphatic pelvic thrusts after that first completion to Trey Nixon. So there's all kinds of excitement, all kinds of juice on the offensive side. they were focusing, it seemed like, on getting the ball down the field. This was not a big check down kind of day for the vast majority of practice. They were looking deep, whether it was to Thornton or to Nixon. Kendrick Bourne and Mac Jones were not able to connect on one where there was a play action fake on a zone run. So this is one of those bootleg type plays that we talked about extensively on the Patriots Talk podcast earlier this week, where it looks like, and again, it's very early, it's a small sample size, but we can tell you what we're seeing out there. It looks like the Patriots are working quite a bit on their zone running game. And I said in a mailbag edition of the podcast very recently, man, I would be surprised if they just became a Shanahan style offense. They built their entire offense around that. They have that stuff in their bag. They've run that before. We've seen them run these boot action, play action concepts. A lot of times, especially when Brady was here, right? You don't see the full boot. It's almost a half boot where you fake the zone run. And then instead of rolling back and rolling towards the right side of the offensive line, you end up sort of just as a deeper drop behind center. We saw that plenty of times. A lot of times you'll get sort of the center, David Andrews, to kind of peel back in those situations. And he looks like almost like a personal protector on a punt team. I'm sure you guys can, if you've been watching the Patriots for years, you can picture that kind of play in your mind, and it ends up being a deep shot. We saw that kind of play from Mac Jones. He tried to hit Kendrick Bourne, didn't end up working out, but that just gives you a feel for the kinds of things they were working on today. They also mixed in some screen game work. We're starting to see little pieces of the offense start to come together. And that's what this time of year is about. It's still very, very early. And maybe they'll look at the minicamp tape when they get to training camp and say, this didn't work. We don't like this. Let's move on to something else. Let's try to find something else. But that's where we're at now in terms of the things we've seen them work on. Those zone runs, the play action boots off of it, and some deep shots down the field. That felt like an emphasis today. Okay, so we've talked plenty about Tyquan Thornton. We get some insight from Jeff Grimes. We've talked about this receiver room and how it's performed through 2 days of minicamp. I think you have to feel good about that if you're a Patriots fan. And we've talked a little bit about the practice itself and some of the scheme things that this offense has worked on. Let's talk about some of the young players and guys who have the most, I would say, on their plates right now. And the obvious number one is Cole Strange. He's been out there very consistently, left guard with the top group nonstop. He's been working with Trent Brown on the left side. Again, that's something that we got into on the Patriots Talk podcast with Isaiah Wynn on the right side. And so that's number one, but we'll refrain from getting too much into Cole Strange until the pads come on. Tyquan Thornton, we've talked about him as well. I would say, listen, for a rookie receiver, we've seen him more active than, honestly, I would have expected, especially with the receiver room having the depth that it has. If you looked at him and you said, boy, before we do anything, he's just got to get a little bit bigger. He's got to get into NFL shape, and he's got to learn the offense. And so you're running scout team and Tyquan, and we'll try to figure out a way to use you on special teams. You could almost understand that. You could almost envision that playing out. That hasn't played out that way. I would say the rookie who has gotten even more run with the top group than Tyquan Thornton, though, is fourth round pick, cornerback out of Arizona State, Jack Jones. Now, like Thornton, Jack Jones is incredibly thin, and it stands out as soon as you see him on the field. But he is out there a ton, and he's out there opposite Jalen Mills. I've seen him out there opposite Terrence Mitchell. Malcolm Butler is part of that top cornerback group as well. But Jack Jones is mixing in with those guys. We're seeing him on the field with Kyle Duggar and Devin McCourty and guys that are going to be playing tons and tons of snaps for the Patriots defense this year. And it's been 2 days of this now. And today, Jack Jones got his hands on a Bailey Zappi pass. So this was at a point in time where there was some double barrel action, let's call it, where the Patriots' top offensive group went sort of against the reserves defensively and vice versa on the other side of the field. So it's Bailey Zappi throwing passes is what it is, but he ends up with that pick. We saw him earlier in the practice with a nice pass breakup on Nelson Aguilar when it did look like it was more top group v top group. So, he's coming on and he's making plays, and he clearly has the kind of instincts that put him around the ball quite a bit. And that's something that you'll remember if you followed this time 8 years ago. Man, it's been that long, huh? Around this time 8 years ago, we were saying similar things about Malcolm Butler. It was just a play a day. It was, he's constantly around the ball. Man, this guy's a pain in the ass. You've heard Tom Brady talk about it since then, since Malcolm Butler has become Malcolm Butler. But as an undrafted rookie out of West Alabama, he was constantly making plays. And he was not getting the kind of early reps that we're seeing Jack Jones get as a rookie, but that became his reputation, was that he was sort of a ball hawk. And I think you'd have to say the same for Jack Jones thus far. Now, it hasn't been perfect. We've seen him quite a bit as a punt returner. He muffed one where he actually dove for the football and kind of landed on it. He might have just knocked the wind out of himself because he ended up coming back and practicing fully, but he was on the field for a while. He had another punt later that he muffed. And so maybe they decide that's not for him. But his hands as a defensive back look really good. They look really smooth. They look really natural. And when you're getting as much work as he's getting with these early packages, that's worth taking note of. So that's it for the rookie class right now in terms of guys like Pierre Strong. He's been working with the scout team. Bailey Zappi, I would say, just very briefly on him. He at least is working in with the regular offensive periods, meaning they'll go Mac Jones, Brian Hoyer, Bailey Zappi. They actually in one period today went Mac Jones, Bailey Zappi, and I think Brian Hoyer just took a breather. But at least he's active. We've seen some rookies come to minicamp and they are almost purely observers outside of the positional drills and the conditioning stuff. And then you'll see them try to get in as many reps as they can once the practice is over. Now, Bailey Zappi does stick around and he tries to get in some extra reps, but he's getting reps. And I would say he's getting about the same number of reps as Brian Hoyer right now. Again, the order has been pretty consistently Jones, Hoyer, Zappi when all three of them are working in. But I do think it's noteworthy that the Patriots trust him to not let a period go sideways because he's in there behind center and he doesn't know what's going on. That hasn't always been the case with rookie Patriots quarterbacks. So worthy of note there on Bailey Zappi. Second-year players, Trey Nixon is the one who stands out the most as being the guy that you have to look at and say, I did not see that coming. And so I do wonder, we talked about Jacoby Myers. Is there any way that there ends up being a move there? Again, I would say that would feel highly unlikely to me. But if they feel like they have depth there and they feel like they could get something in return, he's on a 1-year deal right now, but he's only $4 million. And I think at this point, at least, you would get more back for somebody like Jacoby Myers than you would, say, Nelson Aguilar. And so do the Patriots look at it and say, oh, we need to, free up a few $1 million in cap space to be able to operate this season? Does having Trey Nixon as a viable option, if he becomes a truly viable option, does that give them flexibility at that receiver spot? Because it would honestly, it would be hard for me to envision them going into a year with Devontae Parker, Jacoby Myers, Kendrick Bourne, Nelson Aguilar, Trey Nixon, and Tyquan Thornton, all at receiver, and all not non-options in the kicking game, but the kinds of guys that would probably play more of a specialty role in the kicking game. Jacoby Myers has been their punt returner at times, really kind of a backup punt returner. We talked about Thornton as a gunner. Devontae Parker, I don't think he's going to be playing special teams for you. Kendrick Bourne has seen some punt return reps. These guys aren't core special teamers, though, and you're going to go into a season maybe with 6 just true receivers on the roster. It's possible, and it'll depend on how the rest of the roster and the other position groups shake out. But that feels to me like a spot where we could eventually see some kind of move. And if you're hoping to get something back, again, for Nelson Aguilar, what are you getting back right now? I don't know what you get back for Jacoby Myers right now either, but I think it'd be better than what you would get for Aguilar. Conversation for a different day, but Trey Nixon is certainly making a case right now to make the roster. And if he keeps this up and he continues to be a play-a-day guy or a two-play-a-day guy like he was today, and that continues into preseason and the rest of the league sees it, they're reading the reports right now and then they see it in preseason action, I don't think you can afford to let that guy go and say, oh, I'll sneak him onto the practice squad and then we'll bring him up whenever we need him. He might be somebody that you have to keep on that initial roster. So again, that's very far away, but that's one of the interesting trends that we've been able to notice through a couple days of minicamp. One last quick note on the coaching staff, because why not? We have to update you guys all the time on this. I know for some, this is when you shut the podcast off, quite frankly, but that's okay. Not a whole lot new to report. So if you listen to the Patriots Talk podcast earlier this week, you heard us talk about how Matt Patricia was more involved on day one of minicamp. That continued to be the case on day two. He was relaying signals to Mac Jones in 11-on-11 periods that were not just run game periods. They were not run game specific, run game only periods, which is what we had seen from him in previous OTA practices. He is more involved. And so I would say he is trending toward being the offensive coordinator. Joe Judge is still very involved in the 7-on-7s, the passing game specific stuff, because when the offensive line is doing its own thing, Matt Patricia still goes with the offensive line. Bill Belichick, I did not see call signals at all today. So he did a little bit of that at the very end of practice, day one. I didn't see that. I don't believe I saw that on day two. Bill Belichick was very hands-off on day two. It's worth noting that as well as we're talking about the coaches here. It's not just about what are Judge and Patricia doing. Bill Belichick spent the vast majority of what was about a 2-hour practice, a little more than that, on the sidelines, talking to the Utah State defensive coordinator, who goes by the name Ephraim Banda. And he's been there a couple of years. He previously was at Miami, worked with Manny Diaz, head coach, defensive guy Manny Diaz is. Bill Belichick has had a good relationship, is my understanding, with Manny Diaz for some time. And so they worked together, Banda and Diaz at Miami. And so maybe that's the connection there. Bill Belichick has gotten to know Banda just through Diaz and through that Miami connection. But boy, they were together for over an hour on the sideline, just the two of them. On the opposite sideline, you had some other assistants from other programs. Holy Cross, Michigan was in the house today, Florida. Yesterday URI was around. I'm not sure if they were back today for a second day. The Dallas Mavericks had an assistant coach who was back for a second straight day. You had some onlookers who, I believe it was family day for team sponsors. So you had some fans in attendance, very few, but sort of a special VIP crowd. You had Bon Jovi in attendance today with Robert Kraft and Jonathan Kraft. But Bill Belichick on the opposite sideline, close to the media. We know he loves us and he just wants to be around us as much as humanly possible. But he was right there in front of us, watching a lot of these great catches happen basically right at his feet with Ephraim Banda. So interesting to note that as well. Again, like day one, pretty hands-off as opposed to what we had seen previously, where he's there for every offensive drill right alongside Joe Judge, essentially, and helping coach up moment to moment, second to second. How he spent practice today is how you could envision Bill Belichick spending a practice 5 years ago. Josh has got it, or Matty P's got it on the defensive side. And so he's watching, he's paying attention, but he's not actively coaching the way that you would see him in other periods of practice and in other entire practices. So that's it for the coaching wrap up. We'll have more. Again, tomorrow is day 3 of Patriots minicamp. We'll be back at it with the Patriots Talk podcast. Myself, Tom Curran, will break down what happened on day 3. We'll break down some overarching big picture ideas. Are they sticking with this zone running stuff? Is that why Trent Brown's on the left and Isaiah Wynn's on the right? Because they want to run behind big Trent Brown and pound it behind big Trent Brown. again and again and again, and then they can actually boot off of that because they have a right-handed quarterback and it makes more sense than going the other way and having him sort of flip his shoulders around and make it a more difficult throw for him? Is that something we continue to see on day 3? Does Trey Nixon continue to light it up on day 3? Where's Jack Jones? Who's he playing opposite from on the defensive side on day 3? We know the Patriots could use an infusion of young talent at that cornerback spot. That goes without saying. So all of that will be worth watching. We will be there for it all, and we will talk to you then. Thanks so much for listening to Next Pats. Thanks again to Jeff Grimes for filling us in and giving us some more information on Tyquan Thornton, who he had last year at Baylor. Hopefully you enjoyed that conversation. We'll talk to you guys next week.